Today, we'll talk about two terrifying cave stories, both beginning with confident explorers stepping into the unknown, unaware that the cave had its own plan. These aren't just ordinary tales, they are battles against cold stone, fading light, and the quiet terror of time slipping away. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On April 5, 1999, 21-year-old Robert Kennedy set out for a peaceful camping trip with friends. But he didn't know this quiet night under the stars would soon turn into a chilling descent beneath the earth. The expedition was planned near the limestone enclave of Hermit Cave, located on the eastern shore of Fort Gibson Lake, nestled deep in the heart of eastern Oklahoma. Robert, a curious and soft-spoken young man from Mogi, was joined by his stepbrother, Richard Steeler Jr., and their friend Ben Cogley from Tulsa. That night, beneath a blanket of stars, the three men sat around a glowing fire, trading stories about the surrounding caves, especially Hermit Cave, a name familiar to locals but rarely explored in full. Robert had explored the cave's main passage before, a straight, open tunnel that locals often dismissed as dull and uneventful. But what pulled at him weren't the well-worn paths. It was the whispers of narrow, undocumented side tunnels, said to lead to hidden chambers glittering with gypsum crystals and untouched beauty. That night, as the wind shifted and the firelight flickered strangely, a quiet unease settled over the group. The next morning, as they sipped coffee and prepared to leave, Robert suggested a quick detour into the cave. Ben, tempted but bound by an early work shift, declined. That left only two, and with Ben gone, the trio's plan hit a snag. Cave safety rules are strict for a reason. The golden rule of caving warns against entering any cave with fewer than 3 people. That way, if one person gets injured, another can stay behind while the third goes for help. Still, Robert and Richard broke that rule. Dressed casually in jeans and t-shirts and armed with nothing but a single flashlight, the two young men made a fateful choice. They stepped into the gaping mouth of Hermit Cave, ignoring the unease from the night before. The entrance welcomed them with little resistance. Wide, cool, and silent, its walls glistening with moisture. As they moved deeper into the main passage, damp air clung to their skin, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the cavern. Even in its simplicity, the place felt alive. The ground was slick, the ceiling dipped in places. Yet the two moved forward, admiring the smooth limestone and its ancient, weathered beauty. On the way back out, Robert spotted something strange. A side passage barely visible wedged into the rock wall like a secret door. Narrow, winding, just big enough for one person to crawl through. He paused. This was what he had heard about, the undocumented tunnels. His pulse quickened. Against better judgment, he made a decision. "I'll just take a quick look," he told Richard, handing him nothing because he took the only flashlight. The passage was so tight only one person could enter anyway. Richard agreed to wait outside the cave, trusting Robert's promise to be quick. Then Robert slipped in. It wasn't just a simple detour. This side passage twisted and curled like a wormhole carved into the earth, around 150 feet long and full of sharp angles and unexpected dips. To get through, Robert had to flatten his body against the cold stone, crawling inch by inch. Arms first, then shoulders, then hips, like threading himself through a stone tube. There were no flat, open spaces, only curves, narrow bends, and slick limestone that offered little grip. It wasn't just a crawl, it was a calculated physical negotiation with the earth itself. And now, he was alone in the dark, with no backup, no second light, and no one coming in after him. Eventually, Robert reached what local cavers had long whispered about, a formation known as the Keyhole. It was a narrow stone pinch, no more than a few inches wider than a human torso, twisting awkwardly through the rock. Many believe that the moment Robert chose to push through this tight choke point was the moment he sealed his fate. Bent into an unnatural position, Robert twisted and forced himself through the keyhole, inch by inch, pressing his shoulders sideways, exhaling hard to flatten his chest. When he finally made it through, he must have felt like he'd conquered something few dared to attempt. But what he didn't realize was that he had just passed the point of no return. The tunnel beyond widened ever so slightly, and in that brief moment of relief, Robert kept moving forward, not knowing that the way he had come through, head first, would be impossible to reverse feet first. Just a few feet ahead, the passage suddenly began to narrow again, this time more sharply. Robert stopped, heart pounding. It was time to decide. Turn back now or press forward? Not wanting to take a greater risk, he chose to retreat. He began the slow crawl backwards, feet first, but as soon as he reached the keyhole again, his body jammed. He couldn't bend the same way in reverse. He tried adjusting his legs, twisting, pushing, but it was no use. The angle and compression simply wouldn't allow it. After several exhausting minutes, he made a desperate choice. Keep going forward and hope for an opening where he could turn around. But ahead, the cave only got worse. The passage sloped downward at a 30-degree angle and pinched tighter into a cruel hourglass shape. Still breathing heavily, Robert squeezed in, flattening his chest and exhaling every ounce of air from his lungs. With each push, the rock wrapped tighter around him like a vice. Then he stopped. His chest was now wedged, his torso locked. The keyhole was behind him, but this new squeeze was far worse. He tried to pull back, but gravity dragged him forward. To make matters worse, the angle of the tunnel twisted his body. One arm was pinned beneath him. The other had been forced backward by a jagged outcropping of limestone, leaving him unable to push, pull, or even move. It was like being sealed inside a stone straitjacket. The more he struggled, the deeper he sank. Seeing this, Robert Kennedy began to panic. His chest compressed, arms pinned, breath shallow, he started shouting for help. His voice echoed through the limestone, bouncing off damp walls, growing weaker with each cry. Outside, Richard waited, unaware of the nightmare happening just feet beyond the main passage. No one knows exactly how long it took him to realize something was wrong, but eventually his patience gave way to fear. Guided only by the fading light from the cave entrance, Richard dropped to his knees and yelled into the darkness. His voice, just a faint echo, reached Robert. For the first time in what felt like forever, hope flickered in the trapped man's mind. He yelled back, his voice strained, telling his stepbrother he was stuck and he couldn't breathe. Driven by instinct, Richard crawled headfirst into the narrow crevice, groping through the dark, heart pounding. But within a few feet, the darkness swallowed him. No flashlight, no way to see. Just the smooth, cold rock pressing in around him. Realizing how dangerous it was, Richard stopped. He told Robert he had to go back, to call for help. Roughly an hour later, a rescue team of 10 assembled at the entrance of Hermit Cave. Each was an experienced responder, but none were fully prepared for what they'd face inside. The plan was simple in theory, but difficult in practice. Reach Robert, assess his condition, and pull him out. But the passage leading to him was nearly 150 feet of twisting, low, uneven crawl space. Only one rescuer could enter at a time. Even worse, the deeper they crawled, the more the air thinned. The limestone corridor held onto moisture and cold, making it harder to breathe. Soon, they rigged a makeshift ventilation system, blowing warmed air into the tunnel just to keep the rescuers functional. When they finally reached Robert, the reality hit hard. He was wedged too deep, too far underground to drill a vertical shaft. That option was off the table, so instead they picked up chisels and hammers and began manually widening the stone around the keyhole compression, bit by bit, flake by flake. But time was running out. Rescuers rotated in shifts, crawling in, working until they were too exhausted to continue, then backing out to let the next one try. Still, progress was slow. After hours of relentless digging, one of the rescuers finally broke through the keyhole compression and reached Robert's feet. He was still unresponsive, his body limp and silent. But when they checked his legs, they felt it. A faint pulse. That tiny rhythm stirred hope in the exhausted team. It meant Robert Kennedy was still alive, but only just. They tried to pull him back by his ankles, bracing themselves against the jagged tunnel floor. But without leverage, nothing budged. He was wedged too tightly, stone pressing against his chest like a vice. Even the idea of installing a pulley system collapsed when they realized the limestone and gypsum surrounding the area were too soft. Hooks wouldn't hold. Under tension, they'd rip straight out of the walls, so the team went back to the only option they had: dig. Piece by piece, they began widening the hourglass-shaped pinch point, carefully chipping away at the surrounding stone. It was delicate work. One wrong move and they could cause a collapse, or injure Robert further. They couldn't even pass him water. The rock had encased his torso so tightly it was like a natural coffin, wrapped around his ribs. His breathing, if he was breathing, was invisible, inaudible. Still, they worked, inch by inch, hour by hour. Finally, after more than 5 hours of back-breaking rescue, the stone released its grip. With a coordinated pull, the team freed Robert Kennedy from the Earth's grasp and dragged him out of the crevice, back into the main passage and toward the entrance of Hermit Cave. Paramedics were already waiting in the chilled night air. They rushed forward, ready to check his vitals, administer oxygen, do whatever it took to keep him alive. But it was too late. Robert showed no signs of life. It's believed he lost consciousness deep inside the passage, overwhelmed by chest compression, lack of oxygen, and sheer exhaustion. Trapped for hours, his body simply couldn't hold on. His first real cave exploration became his last. And the harrowing rescue that followed, etched into the memory of every man who tried to save him, stands as a solemn reminder. Caves don't forgive mistakes. In those lightless, twisting tunnels beneath eastern Oklahoma, one wrong decision cost Robert Kennedy everything. As we leave behind the echoing silence of Hermit Cave, another story of claustrophobic terror awaits. This time of a man whose passion for caving would lead him into the depths of one of the most treacherous caves in California. Brent Colvin, a 39-year-old software engineer from Valley Center, California, was no stranger to the challenges of Thunder Canyon Cave. Located in McCain Valley about 70 miles east of San Diego, the cave was notorious for its narrow passages, slippery slopes, and unpredictable water flow. The cave, known as a talus cave, had a reputation for its dangerous drop-offs and sharp boulders. The adventure of entering one entrance and exiting through another had always been a draw for seasoned cavers like Brent, who had been exploring for over a year. His meticulous nature, honed by his demanding career, made him an advanced caver, always prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. Together with his group of 6 fellow cavers, including Luca Carabini the guide, Brent was eager to once again tackle the adrenaline-pumping challenges of Thunder Canyon Cave, unaware that this trip would push them all to their limits. It was Sunday, May 3, 2010. The morning sun was already warming the desert floor when the group set off, their boots crunching over dry sand and scattered rock. For nearly 2 hours, they hiked across open terrain, backpacks shifting with every step, sweat starting to build under the weight of their gear. By 11 a.m., they reached the cave entrance, a rough opening tucked into the base of a rock wall, surrounded by scattered boulders and scrub. The group took a short break to rest, drink water, and prepare. Then came the routine. Wetsuits pulled on, helmets strapped tight, lights tested, ropes coiled and clipped in. Their plan was simple. First, descend into the cave, follow the downstream passage, then pause at a central junction to decide which route to explore deeper. But the very first obstacle was a serious one. Just beyond the entrance, the ground fell away sharply. To enter the cave, they had to descend a 45-foot drop, about 13 meters, straight down a wet rock face and through a narrow waterfall into a pool of cold water below. The rope system they used was a double-line rappel, anchored securely to a large boulder above. Each person had to wrap the rope around their body and lower themselves into the darkness, carefully managing their descent through the water. Brent volunteered to go first. He moved slowly, checking his footing as water splashed across his helmet and wetsuit. The cold hit him halfway down. At the bottom, he stepped into the chest-deep pool, shivering slightly but grinning. He'd been planning this trip for weeks, and the adrenaline from the descent was exactly what he'd been waiting for. Steve came next. He wasn't as steady. Halfway down, he got caught in the waterfall, spun slightly, and slipped against the wall. He landed safely but soaked. The cold got to him quickly. As he waited for the others, he began shaking uncontrollably, his arms pulled in tight to his chest. He paced a little, trying to stay warm. Luca noticed. Something was off. With the rest of the group down safely, Luca took a moment to check in. "Anyone want to head back?" he asked, looking around. There was hesitation, but no one said yes. They had all come here to explore, and for now, they would keep going. The next challenge was already waiting, an 80-foot vertical drop deeper inside the cave. It took about 10 to 15 minutes to set up the rigging. The rock here was slick, and the air had turned sharply colder, the kind of chill that clings to skin even through thick wetsuits. They continued forward, crawling through narrow gaps, climbing over uneven rock, and wading through freezing pools that reached up to their waists. At times, they had to shimmy sideways with barely enough room to turn their heads. The tunnel twisted and dropped in sections, and 2 more rappels were needed to navigate the deeper levels. This time, things went more smoothly. Each team member descended carefully, one after the other. No slips, no tangled ropes. Just a slow, steady rhythm. By 3 p.m., after hours of climbing, crawling, and wading through icy pools, the group arrived at one of the most infamous parts of the cave system, a narrow fissure known among cavers as the Terrible Traverse. It got that name for a reason. The passage turns sharply at a right angle into a 9-inch wide granite crack, barely enough room for a human body to move sideways. You can't look up. You can't turn your head. Once you're in, you're in. Someone had placed a wooden board across the bottom edge of the crack, a simple but important safety measure to stop cavers from accidentally sliding too far and becoming wedged in the drop below. That's because this crack doesn't just stay tight, it goes vertical, a terrifying 200 feet straight down. If you slipped, that's where you'd go. But if you could push through the crack successfully, you'd be less than 5 minutes from the downstream exit of the cave. This was the group's goal for the day. The finish line was finally close. After hours of navigating boulder piles, sliding through cold, wet passageways, and rappelling into darkness, they were nearly there. Brent was feeling it. His legs were sore, his wetsuit was soaked through, and his shoulders ached from hauling gear and ropes. But he was grinning. He had never made it this far before. Reaching this spot meant something. It wasn't just about finishing a hard trip, it was personal. This tight crack, this section of the cave, was a milestone, a place few ever reached, and Brent wanted to be one of them. Not just for the thrill, but to prove to himself and the others that he could. The group removed their harnesses and clipped them to their packs. There was no room for gear in this part. It had to be done light. Luca, the experienced guide, volunteered to go first. Taking slow, steady breaths, Luca shimmied into the tight space. Inch by inch, the guide slipped into the granite wall, helmet scraping the ceiling while vanishing into the darkness. Once through, Luca called back to offer help from the far side. Next was Steve. But Steve was not doing well. The cold had soaked into him hours ago. His hands were stiff, his movement slower. He hadn't eaten much, and he hadn't done many cave trips before this one. This was all new and overwhelming. Still, he wanted to push forward. He climbed up to the crack, placed a hand on the granite wall, and started in. But almost immediately he tried to rush. Maybe he thought moving quickly would get it over with, but in a space that tight, there's no room for panic. He twisted too soon, angled his shoulder wrong, and got stuck. His breathing quickened. He tried to wiggle free, but his chest was wedged in tight. His helmet pressed against the rock. His boots kicked uselessly behind him. The tightness, the darkness, the isolation, it overwhelmed him, and this was his worst fear. After 10 tense minutes of pulling, pushing, and carefully adjusting his position, the team finally managed to yank Steve free from the crack. He slid out gasping, shaking, and completely spent. He had never experienced anything like that, being pinned between two stone walls, unable to move, with only the sound of his own breathing and the pressure of the cave crushing in around him. That moment changed everything for Steve. He sat quietly on the cold rock floor, catching his breath. It hit him. He was in over his head. This trip was far more advanced than what he had trained for. He needed to leave, and he needed to leave now. While Steve sat off to the side trying to recover, 3 more cavers, moving slowly and carefully, passed through the crack without much trouble. One by one, they squeezed sideways into the tight gap and emerged on the other side where Luca was waiting. Luca, now on the far side, escorted the 3 safely to the cave's exit. Figuring that Brent and Jim, both seasoned, confident cavers, could manage on their own for a while, Luca made the call to return later. They had more experience than the rest, and Luca trusted their judgment. Now it was Brent's turn. He was second to last, just behind Jim. But Brent paused. His eyes locked on the same narrow passage Steve had just been trapped in. He had never gone through anything like it before, and just looking at it made his heart race. It was tighter than he imagined, the kind of space where one mistake could leave you stuck, and he had no idea Luca wasn't there anymore. If he had known, he would have waited. He needed Luca's guidance to make it through safely. The move required precision. Feet first, sliding them down the length of the crack, then rotating the body sideways to shimmy along before dropping about 5 feet into the next chamber. The margin for error was razor thin. Brent gave it one look and backed away. Something in him, instinct maybe, told him it wasn't going to work. But then Jim, already halfway through, called back and encouraged him to try. Brent didn't want to be the one to cause delays or make the group retrace hours of cave work just for him, so instead of turning back, he made a choice. He removed his wetsuit to reduce bulk, stripped down to just a t-shirt, and tried again. Feet first, he began to slide into the crack, but his hips jammed. He pushed harder. His legs went partway through and his feet poked out the far side. But that was it. His left arm reached out behind him, trying to support his upper body. His hand rested on an old wooden plank placed across a gap to protect cavers from falling deeper into the vertical fissure. Now the tension was real. He was wedged between cold stone walls. The pressure built around his ribs and hips. His chest compressed, his arms were locked in place. He tried to twist, nothing. He tried to back out, nothing. His face pressed against the icy granite, the sound of his own breath echoing inside his helmet. Brent wiggled and strained, but nothing worked. He was completely stuck. Sweat started to bead across his forehead. He could feel it sliding down his face even in the cold. His breathing grew faster. His heart pounded against the unmovable stone. And in that moment, it hit him. This was the one thing he feared most. Alone in the tightest part of the cave, unable to go forward or back, with no one in sight and no way out. Luca finally made his way back into the cave. As he approached the narrow fissure, he could hear Brent's low moans echoing softly between the granite walls. That was all he needed to hear. Adrenaline kicked in instantly. He rushed forward and joined Jim, who was already trying to help. Together, they did everything they could think of, twisting, pulling, adjusting, but Brent was jammed in tight. Time dragged on. 2 hours passed. Brent's arms began to go numb. His body had slowly slid deeper into the crack, down into a tighter section where the gap was only about 8.5 inches wide. Now his entire weight rested on his left elbow, while his chest and back were pressed hard against the cold, unyielding granite walls. Jim tried pulling again, harder this time, but the movement caused sharp pain and Brent yelled out. It wasn't working, and it was more than just Brent at risk now. Jim was still behind him in the passage with no way forward and no way back. If Brent couldn't get out, Jim couldn't either. That's when things began to feel urgent. The group did what they could with what they had. They shielded Brent with jackets and scraps of fabric, anything that could hold in body heat. The air in the fissure was frigid, and hypothermia was now a serious risk. They told Brent to keep moving, even just a toe, even just a twitch. Anything to stay conscious. Brent began kicking his right leg slowly and rhythmically. Apart from Jim's headlamp, they were in near total darkness. The flickering light cast long shadows across the narrow walls, and the air felt still. As Brent drifted in and out of a dreamlike state, Jim kept talking to him, telling stories, cracking jokes, doing anything to keep him awake. Brent had now been stuck for 5 hours, and a grim silence had settled in. Inside, Brent thought it might be the end, but he wasn't ready to quit. He thought about his wife, Raina. Her face flashed in his mind, the sound of her voice, the life waiting for him outside the cave. That was enough to keep him going. But they needed real help. When it became clear that neither Jim nor Luca could get him out, Luca made a decision. He turned and started climbing out of the cave, retracing the difficult path on his own. He hiked 2 miles across desert terrain, reached a vehicle and drove until he could get a signal. Then, at the top of a hill, he dialed 911. But there was a problem. In the rush, Luca accidentally called for a medical team, not cave rescue. This delayed the response. It wasn't until 6:40 p.m. that Sheriff Sergeant Don Parker, the county's search and rescue coordinator, was officially notified. Then, 2 specialized rescue teams were mobilized. Soon, help started arriving. Responders from the San Diego Fire Rescue Department, the San Bernardino Sheriff's Department, Border Patrol, and the Bureau of Land Management were dispatched. Among them were Ben and Brian, 2 nearby cavers who had heard the radio chatter and came to assist. They climbed down, reached Brent, and covered him with their wetsuits to help keep him warm. Finally, the BORS TAR paramedics, an elite unit trained for rescues in hostile environments, arrived. It didn't take them long to realize the seriousness of the situation. They immediately called for backup. Only then did the command post begin to fully grasp what they were dealing with. Being stuck in a cave isn't always fatal, especially for trained cavers. Many have faced tight squeezes and learned how to stay calm, shift carefully, and find a way out. But sometimes, despite training, extraction becomes nearly impossible. And in those cases, people do die. 7 hours after Brent became trapped, Luca spotted the rescue helicopter in the sky above the desert. But the rough terrain surrounding the cave made it incredibly difficult to locate the exact site. Let alone find a spot to land, it took another 4 hours before the helicopter crew could identify the cave's position and find a clearing safe enough to land. Back on the ground, the medical team had grown deeply concerned. Brent was at serious risk of developing compartment syndrome, a condition where swelling compresses the chest, putting pressure on the heart and lungs. If that happened, cardiac arrest could follow. His chances were beginning to look grim. With Brent now 9 hours in, drifting in and out of delirious, nonsensical visions, the medical staff made an urgent call to the rescue team. They needed them there immediately. While en route, the rescue specialists, veterans of countless difficult cave missions, began to develop a tactical plan. They asked if ATVs or additional helicopter support would be available to carry their extensive equipment: gear bags, food, water, ropes, and specialized extraction tools. They had all been inside this cave system before. That gave them an edge, but they knew it wouldn't be easy. This was the Boulder Tealess Cave, a place where boulders cover the land like camouflage, making it hard to spot even in daylight. It's a mess of false entrances and look-alike rock formations, but the rescue team had precise coordinates, and they moved quickly. As more rescuers arrived, the area around the cave transformed into a hive of focused, professional activity. They descended a steep, rocky hill without trails and markers to get down to the cave entrance. The trek took about an hour. Once inside, they carefully made their way through the familiar but treacherous passages until they reached Brent. He was still trapped in the tight fissure, wedged in place, barely conscious. The lead cave rescuers assessed the scene immediately. They spoke directly to Brent and to the others around him, explaining the hidden danger of hypothermia in these conditions. Most people don't realize how lethal it can be. Brent was stuck in a crack barely 9 inches wide, his body pressed on all sides by cold granite. While the air in the cave was a mild 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius, it didn't matter. His entire body was in contact with rock that was slowly draining the heat from him. And unlike in open air, he couldn't move, not even slightly, to help himself warm up. They explained that when you're wedged between two 70-degree surfaces, you can't survive long. Your body temperature drops until it matches your environment, and by the time it does, it's already too late. So the first priority was simple but urgent: warm him up. They placed heat packs around his torso, arms, and legs. Someone gave him a small sip of electrolyte solution to fight off dehydration and help with alertness. Both Brent and Jim were in early stages of hypothermia, and both needed to get out of the cave as soon as possible. Then, the rescuers turned their attention to the physical challenge of freeing Brent. Just above his head, a wooden plank had been wedged across the gap to prevent cavers from falling further into the fissure. The team used jacks and tools to gently lift and angle the plank, creating a small amount of extra space. The goal was to rotate Brent's body just enough to slide him back out. Then came the hard part. As they began to pull on his feet, Brent let out a sharp wail of pain. His body was still compressed, bent, and jammed in a position never meant for movement, but the rescuers knew they had to keep trying. Carefully, deliberately, with every ounce of strength and skill they had, the rescuers asked him gently if they should stop, if the pain was too much. But Brent, eyes wide with desperation, shouted back, "Keep going! I don't care if you break my ribs, just get me out!" The rescuers pushed forward with everything they had: John Norman, Paul Stivell, Mark Bender, Mark Kinsey, and Robert Hill. These were the main rescuers physically working to pull Brent free. They were a skilled, determined team, and now they had only one mission: get Brent out of that crack alive. Down near Brent's lower half, another part of the crew began to rig anchors high in the fissure wall, attaching ropes to the board wedged alongside Brent's torso. The idea was to use mechanical advantage, a system of pulleys and leverage, to raise both the board and Brent at the same time. The first attempts didn't work. The rock simply wouldn't budge. So the team brought in more tools. Someone suggested a car jack, and another rescuer arrived carrying a 2-meter-long, 6 to 8-foot beam of lumber. Once the jack was maneuvered into position inside the cramped cave, they gave it a try, but again, nothing moved. Then someone gave another hard pull on the mechanical system. Brent shifted 3 inches. That was the breakthrough. Sensing the chance, John Norman grabbed Brent and began to yank, hard. The motion was agonizing. Brent screamed as the pressure surged through his ribs and spine, but the team didn't let go. Blankets around him were stripped away. The rescuers pulled with everything they had. And finally, Brent came loose. His body slid out of the rock like a cork from a bottle, and suddenly he was lying on open stone, stunned, eyes blinking slowly in disbelief. At first he didn't know where he was. Then it hit him. He was free. Joy washed over him like a wave. It was 3:45 a.m. and he'd been trapped for nearly 12 hours. They handed him an electrolyte drink, helped him sit up, and let him rest. He was bruised, scraped, sore to the bone, but alive, and so deeply grateful. With slow, shaky steps, Brent climbed his way out of the cave. Then a helicopter winched him up from the rocky slope and flew him to an ambulance waiting nearby. Rescue workers checked him over. Nothing broken, just some scrapes and a sore body. He smiled through the pain. Brent later said he wasn't giving up cave exploration, but he'd be avoiding tight squeezes for a while. Around the same time Brent was freed, Jim also made it through the crack and emerged behind him. Both were safe. In total, 10 cave team members participated in the operation, with additional support from Borstar paramedics and a San Diego Sheriff's SR member who handled communications from the cave entrance. It was one of those rescues where everything could have gone wrong, but somehow with skill, determination, and a bit of luck, everyone made it out alive.